Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are really wrestling with something that hits close to home for a lot of us, the whole dilemma around eating meat.
Yeah, it's a big one.
Well,
And we're trying to move past that sort of simple yes or no, eat meat, don't eat meat.
exactly, that binary choice, it feels, well, insufficient sometimes. We want to dig into the practical alternatives, the ethical ways, the ecological ways people are actually producing and consuming meat right now.
That's the mission today. Really contrasting the dominant industrial system, the CAFOs, the huge feedlots, with these other ways. More pastoral systems, high welfare farming,
Yeah.
places where animals are treated as like part of a living ecosystem.
Right, exploring the path for what you might call the conscientious carnivore. But before we jump into that alternative vision, we have to acknowledge this core tension, right? This ethical complexity. Some writers call it the vegetarian paradox.
hmm It's a really important point to start with, because this paradox kind of forces us to admit there's no perfectly clean plate, is there? One of our sources puts it pretty bluntly. They say they're unimpressed by arguments that condemn animal harvest while ignoring, wholesale, the animal killing that underwrites vegetal foods.
That's a tough pill to swallow, but it's
Mm.
necessary. We focus so much, and rightly so, on the cruelty in factory farms, but we often, maybe conveniently, overlook the damage from growing crops intensively.
Exactly. You think about it, the pesticides used for grain, soy, vegetables, they kill countless small animals.
Hmm.
Mice, birds, insects, you name it. And then there's the sheer habitat destruction needed to clear land for those massive monoculture fields that grow our bread, our pasta. Even the ingredients for those veggie burgers everyone talks about.
So the argument is that maybe, just maybe, raising and harvesting an animal responsibly, with intention, with care, seeing it as part of a cycle, might actually be less destructive overall than the sort of mechanized devastation of large-scale crop farming.
That's the crux of it, yeah. It's a challenging idea. But if that's the case, then the goal isn't necessarily total abolition. It's about supporting systems where animals get to live, as one source puts it, a pleasant, uncrowded life outdoors on bountiful pasture. Understanding how we make that the norm, not the exception.
Okay, so let's really unpack this. To see where we could go, we need a super clear picture of where we are now. The industrial baseline. The system that, let's face it, produces most of the meat on supermarket shelves.
Right. Let's start there.
So the structure of industrial agriculture,
Hmm.
what are its defining features?
Well, the big one is centralization. It's incredibly centralized, designed for massive scale and speed. And within that system, things like livestock and even the farmland itself, they're fundamentally viewed as, well, just commodities.
Like cogs in a machine,
Yeah.
not living things or ecosystems.
Pretty much. Purely economic units. And this has a huge impact on the people involved too, especially farmers.
Mm.
Because the decisions are made on the farm. They're made by executives, often far away in corporate offices. People who, frankly, might never set foot on the land they're controlling.
And this reduces independent farmers too.
To something closer to employees or contractors, really. They're often told exactly what inputs to use, what breeds to raise, how to manage everything. They lose their autonomy.
So if a farmer wants to do things differently, maybe raise animals on pasture outside the corporate specs.
They often find themselves completely shut out.
Huh.
No processor will take their animals, no distributor will handle them. They're locked into that centralized model, like you said.
And this centralization seems to be getting worse, right? With all the consolidation we've seen.
Oh, absolutely. Just look at the big retailers. Take Walmart's move back in 2019. They decided to build their own entire supply chain for Angus beef, from the ranch all the way to the shelf.
Wow, end-to-end control.
Exactly. And they were open about why. The meat aisle was key to boosting their grocery business. When a player that massive controls the whole chain, they can dictate prices, squeeze out independent ranchers, and basically kill off any real competition. It concentrates power incredibly effectively.
And when that power is focused purely on efficiency and cutting costs, well, the first casualty is usually animal welfare in these CIFO's concentrated animal feeding operations.
Without a doubt. The stories are just brutal. And sometimes, even when campaigners win a victory, like restricting certain kinds of confinement, the suffering just changes shape.
Can you give an example, like in pork production?
Yeah, pork is a really stark example. There's been a big push and some success against the gestation crate, those tiny stalls where pregnant sows were kept, unable to even turn around.
Okay, so that's progress, right?
Sort of. Often the sows are just moved to small group pens, which is marginally better.
Yeah.
But then comes farrowing. When they give birth, they're put into farrowing crates. According to sources like Jonathan Safran IV, they are just as constrictive, The sow is locked in place, again unable to turn, ostensibly to protect the piglets from being crushed, but it's still extreme confinement.
And the conditions, the specific accounts are hard to hear.
They really are. Whistleblower reports talk about workers beating pregnant pigs, sometimes with, heavy tools, just to force them into these crates. Sometimes the animals die from injury or even starvation because they can't reach water while locked in that position.
Yeah.
It's systemic cruelty built into the efficiency model. It denies their basic nature.
And packing animals so tightly together, it's not just about welfare, is it? It creates massive public health risks, too.
Oh, absolutely. These CAFOs are basically perfect incubators for new diseases. Think about high-intensity chicken farming. Researchers call it a perfect environment for generating virulent avian flu virus, like the H5N1 strain we hear about.
How does that happen? Why are they so vulnerable?
Well, you have thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of genetically similar animals crammed together in stressful conditions. Their immune systems are weak. And these barns, they aren't biologically secure bubbles. They're often infested with rodents, flies, wild birds, all potential vectors carrying viruses in and out.
So a disease can just rip through the whole population.
Exactly, and mutate as it goes. It's an incredibly unstable system from a biological standpoint. It's like setting up dominoes, just waiting for the right nudge.
Okay, so we have animal welfare issues, public health risks. What about the environmental cost? This industrial model must have a huge footprint.
It's enormous, and fundamentally it runs on a massive energy deficit. Think about what these animals eat, mostly corn and soy, grown in huge monocultures.
Right, which requires fertilizer, pesticides, tractors.
Exactly. It's estimated that producing just 1 calorie of energy from that hybrid corn takes somewhere between 5 and 12 calories of fossil fuel energy as input.
Wait, say that again? 5 to 12 calories in for 1 calorie out.
Yeah. It's kind of shocking when you think about it. We're burning massive amounts of fossil fuels just to grow the feed, to transport it, to run the CAFOs. It's an incredible energy sink just to sustain the system.
That's staggering. And the chemical inputs, the fertilizers.
Also a huge problem. That intensive corn and soy production relies heavily on nitrogen fertilizers. But plants don't absorb all of it. A lot of that nitrogen just washes away.
Where does it go?
Into rivers, lakes, and eventually the ocean. It acidifies freshwater systems. And in coastal areas, it fuels massive algae blooms that suck up all the oxygen when they die and decompose. This creates infamous dead zones.
Like the one in the Gulf of Mexico.
Precisely. Huge areas where basically nothing can live because there's no oxygen.
Yeah.
All driven by excess fertilizer runoff, largely from growing animal feed.
So the system is efficient at churning out cheap meat using fossil fuels, but it's also incredibly efficient at turning natural resources into pollution and waste.
That's a good way to put it. This intense focus on maximizing meat production, using prime land and vast amounts of grain just for feed. It led researchers decades ago to question the whole economic logic. Are these patterns of resource use rational or just profitable within a flawed system?
It sounds like the foundation is fundamentally shaky, ecologically speaking.
Which is why we need to talk about the alternative. If the industrial model is all about production and consumption, what's missing?
And that missing piece, according to thinkers like Wendell Berry, the farmer philosopher,
Yeah,
it's a third term, right?
exactly. Industrial farming operates on two terms. You produce something, then you consume it. Maybe you deal with the waste afterwards, maybe not. But Berry argues that a truly sustainable biological energy system needs the third term, return.
Return. What does that mean in practice?
It means there's no discard, there's no waste in the way we usually think about it. In nature, everything that dies becomes food for something else. It's closed loop.
So it's about closing that loop on the farm.
Precisely. It demands, as Berry says, a higher level of responsibility and care. In this kind of system, all the bodies involved, plants, animals, humans, microbes in the soil, they're all linked. They die into each other's life, live into each other's death.
That's quite poetic, but practically.
Practically, it means the animal eats the grass, its manure feeds the soil life, that soil life makes nutrients available for the grass to grow again. What's taken is given back in a useful form. It's a cycle, a continuous flow of energy and nutrients. Critically, nothing is truly wasted.
Okay, and this philosophical shift, this idea of return, is why something like a grass-fed model is so different, ecologically speaking. It changes the whole energy equation. You mentioned trophic levels earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Let's break that down. A trophic level is just where an organism sits on the food chain. In the industrial model, we take cattle, which should be eating grass, and we feed them grain, corn, and soy.
Right. Stuff grown with all those fossil fuel inputs we talked about.
Correct. So we're essentially pushing them up a trophic level, feeding them processed crops that required huge energy inputs. But in a grass-fed system, the cow stays at its natural trophic level. It eats grass cellulose, which humans can't digest anyway.
And the energy inputs are minimal.
Way lower. You basically need maybe some fencing, water, and someone to manage the grazing rotation.
Right.
You bypass that whole energy-intensive step of growing, harvesting, transporting, and processing feed grains.
So you're avoiding that 5 to 12 calorie fossil fuel debt per calorie of feed.
Exactly. The main energy input might be, in colder places, harvesting and storing hay for winter feeding. But even that is far less intensive than the grain system. The efficiency here isn't about speed or sheer volume. It's about how well nutrients are cycled and how healthy the ecosystem becomes.
And a key part of making that system efficient is actually working with the animal's natural instincts, right? Using them as part of the farm's labor force, essentially.
That's the heart of regenerative agriculture. It's not just having animals on the farm. It's thoughtfully integrating them into the farm's ecosystem management.
Like the example of chickens following cows.
Yeah, that's a classic one. Farmers will have chickens follow the grazing herd a few days later. The cows graze. They leave manure patties. The chickens come along, scratch through those patties.
Looking for bugs.
Exactly. They eat the fly larvae and dung beetle larvae. This drastically cuts down the fly population naturally, without pesticides. Plus, the chickens get free feed, protein-rich insects, and their scratching helps spread the manure more evenly. It's synergy.
That's clever. It turns a potential pest problem into a resource.
And this approach, working with animal nature, it changes the whole dynamic of handling them too. It's less about brute force, more about understanding behavior, like that story about the child moving the herd.
Yeah, tell us that one again. An 8-year-old moving 100 cows.
It sounds unlikely in an industrial context, right? But in this system, the cows were moved daily to fresh pasture using temporary electric fences. They got used to the routine. They knew that when the fence was moved, there was fresh grass waiting. So the child just had to open the way to the next paddock, maybe call them, and the cows would eagerly move themselves.
Because they wanted the fresh grass.
Exactly. You're using their natural desire to graze, their herd instinct, their learned routine. It takes way less energy and infrastructure than trying to force animals around who are stressed and familiar with the process. You work with them.
And this principle applies even to animals we have strong stereotypes about, like pigs being lazy.
Absolutely. That lazy pig stereotype is almost entirely an artifact of confinement. If you stick a pig in a barren concrete pen, yeah, it's going to lie around a lot. What else can it do?
But if you give them space, outdoors?
Studies show domestic pigs allowed outdoors behave completely differently. They spend something like 3/4 of their day actively doing stuff, grazing, rooting around in the soil, exploring. They're naturally curious, industrious foragers. The laziness is imposed by the factory farm environment.
Fascinating. And going back to that return idea, even their waste changes when they're on pasture.
Dramatically. Factory farm pig manure is this toxic slurry, right? Awful smell, full of ammonia, a huge pollution problem. But when pigs are eating pasture, lots of green stuff, chlorophyll, their manure is different.
How so?
It's described as pasture poop. It's much drier, more fibrous because of all the grass, and it doesn't have that overpowering noxious odor. It breaks down easily, adding organic matter back to the soil, fertilizing the field instead of polluting the water. Again, it closes the loop. Waste becomes a resource.
So underneath all of this, the animal integration, the nutrient cycling, the real foundation is the soil itself.
Absolutely. That's the cornerstone of regenerative and organic approaches. The farmer's primary job isn't just producing a crop or an animal. It's being a steward of the soil, building its health, its organic matter, its carbon content year after year.
And healthy soil pays dividends.
Huge dividends. Soil rich in organic matter acts like a sponge. It holds much more water, so you need less irrigation, and it's far more resilient during droughts.
And erosion.
Much less erosion. Healthy soil structure holds together better against wind and rain. There was a study comparing 2 neighboring wheat farms in Washington state over nearly 40 years. The conventional farm lost about 8 inches of topsoil. The organic farm next door, only 2 inches.
8 inches versus 2 inches. That's the farm's future washing away on the conventional side.
Pretty much. It starkly illustrates the difference between farming against the land, depleting its resources, and farming with the land, maintaining and even enhancing its productivity over time. But this regenerative approach, this stewardship, it takes time, it takes skill, it takes care. And that brings us to the big unavoidable question. What does it cost?
Right, because this vision of healthy soil, happy animals, closed loops, it sounds wonderful, but it doesn't sound cheap, especially compared to the industrial model optimized for low prices.
It isn't cheap, and that's a reality we have to confront. Wendell point, echoed by others, is crucial here. Eaters must understand that eating takes place inescapably in the world. How we eat determines how the world is used.
So if we want the world used well, if we want humane standards, ecological health, that return, we as eaters have to accept that the price tag on that kind of food will be higher.
It has to be. You simply can't achieve those things at the speed and scale, and therefore the low cost, of the industrial centralized system. You're paying for more labor, more skilled management, better conditions, ecological services like soil building. You're paying for the true cost of production, not just the lowest possible price achieved by externalizing costs onto the environment or animal welfare.
But that higher price runs smack into a system that's actively pushing prices down, right? We talked about centralization and corporate power.
Exactly. That centralized system, with its history of price fixing and squeezing farmers, has created an artificially low baseline for meat prices. It's devastated independent producers for decades.
And you mentioned this isn't new. The pressure on independent farmers goes way back.
Oh, yeah. Sources point to a kind of forgotten farm depression that actually started way back in 1920, long before the Great Depression everyone knows about.
What caused that?
A combination of things. Massive debt from wartime expansion, followed by plummeting commodity prices after World War I. Farmers couldn't pay their loans, banks foreclosed, land got consolidated into fewer, bigger hands. It really set the stage for the industrial, commodity-focused system we have now. The decline of the small, independent farmer has been a long, slow burn.
Okay, so we have ethical food that necessarily costs more, existing within an economic system that punishes independent farmers and favors cheap industrial production. This immediately raises issues of privilege and access, doesn't it?
Absolutely critical issues. This isn't just a matter of voting with your fork if you can't afford the options.
Yeah.
One source points out that back in 2017, the average monthly income for the middle 40% of people worldwide was less than $700.
$700 a month for a family.
Yeah. For people living on that kind of budget, paying a premium for grass-fed beef or pasture-raised chicken, it's just not feasible. It's completely out of reach. We have to be really honest that currently the ethical food movement largely serves a relatively affluent slice of the population.
So framing it solely as individual consumer choice misses the bigger picture.
It risks missing the systemic issues. One author, John Smaj, makes a provocative point. Maybe the middle classes concerned about ethical food would be better off politically allying with lower income groups.
Why? What's the connection?
Because the underlying problem isn't just what food is available, but the economic system itself.
Yeah.
The centralization of wealth and power that leaves so many with low wages and limits their choices, forcing reliance on the cheapest, often least healthy options.
And this plays out geographically, too, in so-called food deserts, even in wealthy countries.
Definitely. That story about Walmart in Washington, D.C. is a stark reminder. They promised new stores, including one in Ward 7, a predominantly black, lower-income area with few grocery options.
And then they pulled out.
They pulled out of the Ward 7 store deal in 2016, leaving residents right back where they started with very limited access to fresh, healthy food. When the big corporations fail to deliver, or when the economics don't work for their model, entire communities can be left stranded with only processed industrial food readily available.
Okay, so if the current globalized capitalist system tends towards centralization and inequality, and the niche market for high-cost ethical food isn't the scalable solution for everyone, what's the alternative path towards something more egalitarian?
The vision some thinkers propose is a shift towards more localized systems. Think diversified local farming, smaller scales, what Smaj calls a local auto system.
Auto system, meaning self-contained.
Sort of, yeah. Less reliant on global commodity chains and massive corporations, more focused on meeting local needs from the local environment.
How would that work? How is it more egalitarian?
Well, it's complex, no doubt. It requires communities building consensus, figuring out how to make a living from their immediate ecological base. But the potential for egalitarianism comes from reconnection. Farms are drawn back into their local context.
So producers and consumers know each other.
Potentially, yes. Or at least there's a much tighter loop. Producers, consumers, processors, distributors, citizens, they might be the same people wearing different hats. There's more accountability, more shared investment in the local food system's health, rather than just selling anonymously to a distant market driven solely by price. It's about building resilient, democratic, local food economies.
Okay, this shift, whether towards a local auto system or just supporting better practices within the current system, it clearly demands a different mindset from us, the consumers. If we accept that ethical meat costs more, how does that change our relationship with it?
It has to change fundamentally. We need to move away from seeing meat as this cheap, everyday staple that we expect at almost every meal. That expectation is largely a product of the industrial system's artificial cheapness.
So instead,
Instead, high-quality, ethically raised animal products become, well, maybe more like a celebratory food. Something you appreciate more because you consume it less often, and you choose it with intention. You understand the story behind it, the stewardship involved.
eating less meat, but better quality meat when you do.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Reduce the overall quantity, but prioritize meat from sources you trust, sources that are transparent and ecologically sound. That shift in demand is a powerful signal.
Which brings up transparency again. If you're paying that premium, how do you know you're getting what you pay for? How do you verify the ethical or ecological claims and avoid greenwashing?
Transparency is absolutely key. And honestly, the best way to get it is often by buying local. If you can buy directly from a farmer, maybe even visit the farm, talk to them. That's the gold standard.
You can see the conditions for yourself.
Right. You can ask questions. You can build
Yeah.
trust. That direct connection allows you to verify the humane treatment, the pasture management, the things you value. That's almost impossible to do when you're buying anonymously through a long, opaque industrial supply chain.
Beyond meat, we also need to be smarter about food in general, especially processed foods, right? Sometimes we think we're making healthy choices, but the processing itself is the problem.
Oh, definitely. We need to understand what refined food really means today. Historically, it might have meant, fancy sauces or pastes for the wealthy. But now, refined usually means industrially processed for maximum profit, often at the expense of nutrition.
You mentioned the bliss point earlier. What is that?
It's a term researchers like Michael Moss use. Food companies scientifically engineer products to hit the perfect combination of fat, sugar, and salt, to maximize palatability, basically, to make it as addictive and desirable as possible.
To make us eat more and buy more?
Precisely. It hits that pleasure center in the brain. The goal is profit maximization, driven by consumption, not necessarily nutritional value. So you end up with hyper-palatable foods that can be surprisingly low in actual nutrients.
And this focus on refinement ties back into some of the dietary advice we've gotten over the years, like about replacing fats.
It really does. For decades, the advice was often, cut saturated fat, eat more carbohydrates. But what kind of carbs replace the fat?
Often highly refined ones, white bread, sugary cereals, processed snacks.
Exactly. And replacing, say, saturated fat from butter or meat with highly refined carbohydrates can be, well, counterproductive for health.
Why is that?
Because those refined carbs break down incredibly quickly in your body. They cause rapid spikes in blood sugar followed by insulin surges. Over time, that constant up and down, that inflammatory response is linked to a whole host of chronic health problems. So just swapping fat for any carb isn't the answer. The quality and processing level of the food matters hugely. We need to look past simplistic rules like fat bad, carb good.
Okay, so be critical about processing. Be critical about labels. As the alternative farming movement grows, there are lots of label certifications, different philosophies. How does a conscientious eater navigate all that without getting overwhelmed or, worse, misled?
That's a great question. It can feel like a minefield. One useful concept is developing what Smaja calls a knowing indifference to rigid, off-the-shelf systems or labels.
Knowing indifference? That sounds a bit contradictory. Indifferent but knowledgeable.
Yeah, it means you don't just blindly follow one specific certification like organic or biodynamic or whatever the latest trend is, as if it's the only answer everywhere. Instead, you understand the underlying principles.
Like soil health, animal welfare, nutrient cycling, transparency.
Exactly. You absorb those core philosophies,
Yeah.
and then you apply them thoughtfully, looking at the specific farm, the local context, the climate, the constraints they're working under.
So it's about critical thinking rather than just checking a box for a label.
Precisely. Does this farm, in this place, seem to be genuinely embodying the principles of good stewardship, even if they don't have an expensive certification? It protects you from, get-rich-quick gurus or overly simplistic solutions that don't fit the local reality. It encourages you to be an engaged, knowledgeable participant in your food system, not just a passive consumer following the latest label.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone from the, frankly, quite grim picture of the centralized CAFO system running on fossil fuels, creating pollution, often compromising welfare.
To this alternative vision. Decentralized, more localized farm economies built on ecological principles, synergy, that idea of return.
The shift required feels
Yeah.
huge. It's systemic, moving away from a model that prizes sheer efficiency and scale above all else towards models that value regeneration, integration, and seeing animals as partners in the ecosystem.
It really is a paradigm shift. And for the consumer, the choice becomes about more than just taste or price. It's about consciously choosing to participate in that different moral order, the one based on production, consumption, and that crucial third term, return.
Where the life of the animal and its death is part of a cycle that nourishes the land rather than depleting it, where haste doesn't really exist in the same way.
Right. But we also hit the hard reality. The current economic system actively undermines this. Decades of policies favoring centralization have crushed independent farmers. Global inequality makes ethically produced food inaccessible for billions. Relying only on individual consumer choice within this broken system isn't enough.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. We know the current system relies on cutthroat price competition that often makes ethical farming financially impossible for many producers, and ethical eating an unaffordable luxury for many consumers. So, thinking systemically, what specific political and economic alliances, perhaps between conscientious consumers, struggling farmers, and low income communities trapped in food deserts, what kind of coalition would be needed to actually create a politics of recognition? A system that forces the market to account for the true costs of land stewardship and humane animal care, making ethical food the baseline, the norm, not the niche exception. What would it take to fundamentally challenge that centralized commodity system?